To begin the reassembly, you will need to guide the eyesight cable back into the back case. As you route the cable back in place, you'll also need to put back in the Phillips screws that hold the cable in place. Now snap the camera back onto the camera board. Next, connect the camera cable to the camera board. Then slide the camera board and the camera into place underneath the casing, and then screw in the two Phillips screws. Now gently guide the LVDS cable back into place. Next, plug the LVDS cable back into the LCD. Once the cable is seated all the way in, then snap down the lock mechanism. Now carefully guide the LCD and the LVDS cable back into place. Now that the LCD is in place, screw the 6 Phillips screws back into the LCD. Now put the antenna assembly back in place and guide it over the LVDS cable. Now screw in the small Phillips screws back into the antenna assembly. Now to put the hinges back on. Set the hinge in place and then screw in the 2 T6 screws on the bottom of the hinge and the 1 T6 screw on the top. And then follow the same procedure for the other hinge. Now to reseat the clutch cover. Carefully guide the clutch cover over the cables and then seat it down in place. You will have to start the clutch cover a little right of center, and then slide the clutch cover to the left to lock it in. Now before you reseat the glass, you will need to take a microfiber cloth and clean the LCD. Take your time and remove all the fingerprint smudges. Before you reapply the glass, take some canned air and remove all the dust from the glass. Also use the canned air to remove the dust from the LCD as well. After all the dust is removed, you can then apply the glass. Now reapply the center mounting bracket and screw back in the 2 Phillips screws. Now to install the trackpad. You will first need to guide the trackpad flex cable back into the casing. Then, to seat the trackpad in place, you will need to seat the top of the trackpad first, where the 2 small mounts stick out, and then seat the bottom side of the trackpad. Once the trackpad is in place, you can then reinstall the 4 Phillips screws. Now install the MagSafe board. Now install the 2 T6 screws. Now it's time to remove the logic board from the anti-static bag. You will first need to clean the thermal paste off of the logic board. To do this, you can use a towel and some alcohol. After the logic board is cleaned, it is now time to remove the old thermal paste from the heatsink assembly. Now apply the new thermal paste to the logic board. If you do not use enough thermal paste, your logic board could overheat. If you use too much, the thermal paste will squeeze out and onto the logic board and could cause damage to it. After the thermal paste is applied, you can now reseat the heatsink in place. Now screw the heatsink mounting screws and springs back onto the heatsink. Now install the speaker assembly and the microphone back onto the logic board. Install the 2 Phillips screws back into the speaker assembly. Use your spudger tool to plug back in this microphone cable and the speaker cable. Now stand the board up like this so that you can plug in the MagSafe cable back into the logic board. Now seat the logic board back into place. When putting the logic board back in, make sure that none of the flex cables are getting tucked below the logic board. Now install the 7 T6 screws back into the logic board. Now reseat all the flex cables back onto the logic board. After you seated the top case flex cable into the logic board, press down the tensioner to keep it in place. Now put the metal cable guard back onto the logic board and screw it down with the 2 very small Phillips screws. Now install the fans by first setting them in place. And then put the 6 T6 screws back around the fan. Each fan has 3 screws. And now use your spudger tool to plug the fan cables back into the logic board. Now to install the right speaker assembly. After it is in place, you can then install the 6 Phillips screws to hold down the speaker assembly. Now use your spudger tool to plug the speaker cable back onto the logic board. Now to reinstall the superdrive. Slide the superdrive in place, and then install the 2 T6 screws on the superdrive that is right next to the edge of the casing. Now install the T6 screw on the mount that is closest to the logic board, and then gently plug back in the superdrive flex cable. Now to install the display assembly. Guide the top case onto the hinges where they can screw back in. Now screw in one of the T6 hinge screws on each hinge. After you've put one screw in each hinge, you can then close the display. You can then loosen the hinge screws just enough to adjust the display assembly to make sure that it is flush with the top case. Now that you have the display flush with the casing, you can then install and tighten the remaining hinge screws. Now reseat the right and left cable guides that go over the LVDS cable and antenna cables. Each cable guide has one Phillips screw that has to be reinstalled. After the left cable guide is in place, you can then reattach the LVDS cable and lock it down. Follow the same procedure for the cable guide on the right side. Now install the wireless card back into the wireless mount. And then screw in the 3 Phillips screws that hold down the wireless card. Now plug in the wireless flex cable into the wireless card. You'll notice that the flex cable tells you which side plugs into the wireless card and which side plugs into the logic board. Once you have the cable in place, you can then place the material with the adhesive back over the wireless card. And then place the wireless card back in place over the SuperDrive. Then screw in the 2 Phillips screws that hold the wireless card in place. Now, route the eyesight cable through the mounts and plug it into the logic board. You can now plug the wireless flex cable into the logic board. Now, route the wireless antennas through the mount and plug them into the wireless card. Now to install the hard drive cable assembly. Install the hard drive mount into the side of the casing, and then screw in the 2 long Phillips screws into the mount. And then carefully re-adhere the small flex cable onto the casing. And now screw in the 2 small Phillips screws that hold down the hard drive flex cable. Now plug the hard drive into the SATA connection, and slide the hard drive into the hard drive mount. When the hard drive is in place, you can then put the hard drive mounting bracket in place and screw it down. Now carefully plug the hard drive flex cable onto the logic board. Now to reinstall the RAM chips. First, install the lower RAM chip by inserting it in at an angle and then pressing it down until you hear it click. And then do the same for the upper RAM slot. To install the battery, slide it in at an angle like this, and then install the 3 tri-wing screws that hold down the battery. And now reattach the battery cable to the logic board. Next, you'll need to put the bottom plate back in place. After you seat it in place, you can then gently press on it to snap it in place. Now screw back in the 10 external screws. There are 3 long external screws that go in the back. The only short external screw that goes in the back is on the right side. Now you have completely reassembled your MacBook Pro.